My name is Elias Thorne, and I'm 42 years old now. For most of my life I was what my family called the disappointment. I never thought that the very skills they scorned, the life they called a waste, would one day be the only thing standing between them and a fate they couldn't negotiate their way out of. This is the story of how a plague trapped my celebrated diplomat brother in his own embassy, and how the forgotten son became everyone's last hope. Before I dive into how it all fell apart, and then came together in the most unexpected way, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today. Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever felt like the black sheep of your family, go ahead and hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe, because this is a community for people who understand that sometimes your greatest strengths are the ones nobody else thought to look for. It all began with a phone call, as these things so often do. I was standing in my small clinic in the heart of Ambulon's old quarter, the air thick with the scent of crushed marigold and antiseptic. Outside, the monsoon rains had turned the dusty streets into rivers of red mud. A young girl with wide, fearful eyes sat on my examination table, her mother wringing her hands beside her. The girl had a simple fever, nothing more. But in the Republic of Kaznia, every fever was treated with a gravity my brother, Edward, would have called primitive superstition. I called it caution. I was just finishing wrapping a cool herb-infused cloth around the child's forehead when my satellite phone buzzed irritably on the cluttered desk. The caller ID flashed a name that always managed to tighten a knot in my stomach: Edward Thorne, First Secretary, a name that carried the weight of our family's expectations, all of which he bore so effortlessly. Elias, his voice came through, crisp and impatient, devoid of any real warmth. It was a voice designed for treaties and state dinners, not for familial connection. I trust I'm not interrupting anything important. The unspoken addendum, as always, was anything I would consider important. I glanced at the worried mother and her sick child. What is it, Edward? Father's birthday is next month. Mother is insisting on a family portrait, a proper one. She wants you in it, which means you'll need to fly home. I've had my assistant look at flights. There's a window in 3 weeks. You'll need a new suit. For God's sake, don't show up in one of your linen ensembles. I could picture him perfectly, sitting in his immaculate, air-conditioned office within the gleaming white walls of the embassy complex, a fortress of colonial grandeur perched on a hill overlooking the sprawling, chaotic city I called home. He would be impeccably dressed, a portrait of success, while I was standing here in worn trousers and a shirt damp with sweat and the humidity of a life lived, not observed. Edward, I can't just leave. I have patience. My work is here. A sigh, heavy with condescension, crackled through the phone. Elias, we've been over this. Your work is a hobby. You're a fully qualified physician, with a degree from one of the best universities in the world, and you're wasting it treating common colds and setting broken bones for people who pay you in chickens. It's embarrassing. They're my community, I said, my voice quiet but firm, and they pay what they can. It's more honest than the currency you deal in. Honesty doesn't pay for a respectable life, he shot back. It's been 15 years. When are you going to give up this charitable crusade and come back to civilization? Father is getting older. It hurts him seeing you like this. It wasn't concern for our father that motivated him. It was shame. I was a stain on the pristine portrait of the Thorne family. Edward, the brilliant diplomat, shaping nations, and Elias, the eccentric doctor, gone native in some forgotten corner of the globe. Our paths had diverged so sharply in childhood. He was the golden boy, captain of the debate team, his trophies lining the mantelpiece. I was the quiet one, happier in the garden, studying the intricate lives of plants and insects, my science projects relegated to a dusty corner of the attic. Our father, a man who measured worth in accolades and public perception, had made his preference clear from the start. He'd look at Edward's report card, beaming with pride, and then glance at mine, full of praise from my biology teacher but lacking in the prestigious clubs, and his expression would just... It was a subtle disappointment, but it had carved itself into my soul over the years. Edward learned to crave that approval. I learned to live without it. That choice had led me here, to Kaznia. I'd come as a young idealistic doctor with a relief organization. I was supposed to stay for 2 years. But I fell in love with the land, with its rugged beauty and its resilient people. They had a deep, ancient knowledge of the world around them, a wisdom that wasn't written in textbooks. They taught me about the healing properties of the jungle's flora, about remedies passed down through generations, and they taught me about community, about a network of support that had nothing to do with status or wealth. I had found a home, a purpose that felt more real than anything I'd ever known. To my family, it was an abdication of my duty. To me, it was the first time I'd ever truly felt like myself. "I'll send a gift for Father," I said, ending the conversation before it could curdle further. "My regards to your wife. Goodbye, Edward." I hung up before he could reply, the silence in the clinic suddenly feeling heavy. The little girl was watching me, her dark eyes perceptive. I offered her a small, reassuring smile and finished my work. As her mother thanked me, pressing a small bag of fragrant spices into my hand, I couldn't shake the bitter taste of my brother's disdain. He saw my life as a failure, a collection of wasted opportunities. He could never understand that the connections I had forged here, the trust I had earned, were more valuable than any treaty he would ever sign. He lived in a world of paper and promises, insulated from the raw, messy reality of life and death. I didn't know it then, but his world and mine were about to collide with the force of a tidal wave, and all his carefully constructed walls were about to come crashing down. The first whispers of the crimson bloom started in the markets. A trader from the eastern provinces, they said, had collapsed, then a few members of his family. The stories were vague, embellished with local folklore, but they all shared a few chilling details: a sudden raging fever, a cough that sounded like tearing silk, and a strange petal-shaped rash that bloomed across the skin just before the end. I'd heard similar stories before. The jungle was a crucible of fevers, and every few years it would brew something new and frightening. I began making inquiries, speaking to the local healers, my old mentors. Their faces were grim. This was different, they said, faster, more aggressive. They called it Kayla's kiss, after an ancient spirit of pestilence. I sent a preliminary report to the regional health authority, but my warning was buried under a mountain of bureaucracy. At the embassy, life went on, blissfully unaware. Edward was in his element, hosting a lavish reception for a visiting trade delegation. I knew because he'd sent me an invitation, a gesture that was more about appearances than any genuine desire for my presence. I had, of course, declined. The irony was thick enough to taste. While he was clinking glasses of champagne and discussing tariff agreements, a biological storm was gathering just beyond his gilded gates. My own past with the fevers of this land was what kept me from panicking. When I had first arrived in Kosnia, a naive young man eager to save the world, I had ignored the locals' advice about boiling the water from a certain stream. A week later, I was delirious, burning with a fever that left a faint lace-like pattern on my skin. It was a regional sickness, common in children and rarely fatal if you survived the first few days. My local friends, barely teenagers themselves, had nursed me back to health with bitter teas and cooling poultices. When I wrote to my family about it, my father's response was a terse letter about my irresponsibility. Edward's was a mocking email about my authentic third-world experience. They never understood that that fever had been a form of initiation. It had nearly killed me, but it had also integrated me into the community in a way I never could have planned. My body had learned the landscape's secrets, developing antibodies and immunities that I was only beginning to understand. That childhood illness, as the elders called it, was a shield, one I would soon need. The first case inside the embassy walls was a young Kaznian gardener named Matteo. He was found collapsed in the rose garden, his skin burning, the telltale crimson blooms already appearing on his neck. Panic spread like wildfire. The embassy's small, modern clinic was quickly overwhelmed. Dr. Hayes, a career medical officer nearing retirement, had only ever dealt with diplomatic colds and food poisoning. He diagnosed it as a severe form of hemorrhagic fever and followed the standard protocol, but the treatments had no effect. Matteo died within 12 hours. The next day, 2 of the kitchen staff who had helped carry Matteo to the clinic fell ill. The ambassador, a stern but pragmatic man named Julian Cole, made a swift decision. He ordered the gates sealed. The embassy was officially under quarantine. No one in, no one out. Edward, I later learned, had argued against it. "We can't just cut ourselves off," he had insisted in the emergency meeting. "It sends a signal of panic. It will disrupt the trade talks. We need to maintain an image of calm and control. I can make calls, arrange a medical evacuation for essential personnel. But his calls went unanswered. The Kasnian government, in a state of meltdown, had shut down the airports. Neighboring countries had closed their borders. The world was watching, but from a safe distance. Edward's web of contacts, his carefully cultivated influence, his entire world of negotiated reality had evaporated overnight. He was trapped. They all were. The embassy, once a symbol of power and sanctuary, had become a gilded cage. Inside its walls were nearly 200 people, diplomats, administrative staff, security personnel, their families, and the local Kasnian staff who had been on duty when the gates swung shut. 200 people, locked in with a killer they couldn't see. My satellite phone rang again. It was Edward. His voice was different this time. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle edge of fear. "Elias," he said, the name a plea. "We have a situation here." I listened as he described the symptoms, the rapid progression, the uselessness of their modern medicine. He didn't ask me for help, not directly. His pride wouldn't allow it. He was presenting a problem. As if I were a subordinate, he was consulting for a report. "The official diagnosis is a variant of hemorrhagic fever," he concluded, his tone attempting to reclaim some semblance of authority. "It's not," I said flatly. "It's the crimson bloom. I've seen it. I warned the authorities 2 weeks ago." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "You knew about this." I knew something was coming. "Edward, listen to me. Your clinic's antiviral medications won't work. This isn't a virus in the way you understand it. The local healers believe it's a fungal spore, airborne, that activates in the lungs. You need to stop all air circulation. Open the windows. You're trapping it inside with you." "Open the windows." He sounded scandalized. "That's preposterous. It goes against every quarantine protocol." "Your protocols are getting people killed," I retorted, my patience wearing thin. "Matteo is dead, isn't he? And now 2 more are sick. How many have to die before you stop trusting your rulebooks and start listening to someone who actually knows this place?" He didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, Edward Thorne, the man with all the answers, was silent. The fear in that silence was more profound than any words he could have spoken. His world was built on a foundation of established rules and predictable outcomes. He was a master of that game, but the Crimson Bloom didn't play by his rules. It didn't respect diplomatic immunity. It was a force of nature, wild and impartial, and it was exposing the fatal arrogance of his worldview with terrifying efficiency. He needed me, and the part of me that had spent a lifetime in his shadow, the part of me that was small and wounded, took a grim satisfaction in that fact. But the doctor in me, the man I had become in spite of him, knew that satisfaction was a luxury no one could afford. The real test was about to begin. The first few days of the quarantine were a study in organized chaos. Edward tried to manage the crisis the only way he knew how, with memos, meetings, and color-coded security levels. He established a command center in the main conference room, its long mahogany table now covered in maps of the compound and lists of personnel. He was a general without an army, drawing battle plans against an invisible enemy. His daily briefings, delivered with a forced calm over the embassy's intercom system, were meant to be reassuring, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his growing fear. They were filled with diplomatic jargon, containment protocols, interagency communication, asset management, words that were utterly meaningless against the biological reality unfolding in their midst. I became his unwilling remote consultant. He would call me multiple times a day, his questions becoming more desperate. He described the symptoms of each new patient in excruciating detail, as if by dissecting the plague with words he could somehow control it. I gave him the best advice I could from a distance. I told him to boil water with cinnamon bark and ginger root, to make a steam inhalation that could help clear the lungs. I advised him to keep patients hydrated with coconut water, rich in electrolytes. These were simple palliative measures, the kind of folk remedies he had mocked my entire life. Now he was writing them down like gospel. "Is that all?" he'd ask, his voice tight with frustration. "Herbs and hot water? We have a state-of-the-art medical facility. Your state-of-the-art facility was designed to treat heart attacks and appendicitis, Edward. It wasn't designed for the jungle. This is a different kind of war, and you're trying to fight it with the wrong weapons. His wife, Isabella, was a particular source of his anxiety. She was a fragile, elegant woman, born and raised in a world of manicured gardens and polite society. The raw fear of their situation was taking a visible toll on her. Edward's desperation to protect her was palpable. He had her isolated in their residence, forbidding her from even walking in their private garden. He was trying to build a fortress within the fortress, a futile gesture against an airborne threat. Inside the compound, the social fabric began to tear. The initial solidarity fractured into fear and suspicion. People started hoarding food from the commissary. Whispers and accusations followed anyone who coughed. The local Kasnian staff were treated with open hostility, blamed for bringing the sickness inside the walls. It was a perfect storm of paranoia and prejudice, and Edward, for all his diplomatic skill, was powerless to stop it. He could negotiate a ceasefire between warring nations, but he couldn't broker peace between a terrified cook and a paranoid security guard. My own clinic became a sanctuary in a dying city. The crimson bloom was scything through Ambalon. The official response had collapsed, and the city's hospitals were overflowing. People came to me because they had nowhere else to go. They knew I had survived the fevers before. They believed I had a strength, a connection to the land that could save them. It wasn't magic, it was knowledge. I worked alongside the remaining local healers, brewing vast quantities of the supportive remedies, distributing them to anyone who needed them. We couldn't stop the plague, but we could ease the suffering. We could offer comfort and a fighting chance. My days were a blur of work, fueled by adrenaline and a sense of profound, heartbreaking duty. I would collapse onto my cot for a few hours of dreamless sleep, and wake up to do it all again. During one of Edward's calls, I heard a commotion in the background. A woman was screaming. He quickly tried to muffle the phone. "It's nothing, a personnel issue." "Don't lie to me, Edward. What's happening?" He finally relented, his voice cracking. "It's Hayes, Dr. Hayes. He's collapsed. And a young attaché, a boy named Finn. He's barely 20. He's burning up." The last line of defense had fallen. With their only doctor incapacitated, the embassy was now medically blind. The residents were terrified, their faith in the embassy's ability to protect them shattered. This was the turning point. Edward's voice, when he spoke again, was stripped of all pretense. It was the voice of a man at the end of his rope. "What do we do, Elias? Just tell me what to do." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of 15 years of scorn and dismissal. All those years he had seen my life as a pathetic sideshow, a waste of a brilliant mind. Now his life, and the lives of 200 others, depended on that wasted knowledge. "There's a remedy," I said slowly, thinking of the stories the elders told, the complex preparations they reserved for the most virulent plagues. "It's not a cure, not a simple pill. It's a treatment. It supports the body's fight, gives the immune system the strength to win, but it's difficult to make. The ingredients are specific. Some of them I know you have in the embassy gardens. They were planted for decorative purposes, but they have power." "What are they?" he asked, hope and skepticism warring in his tone. I listed them: the fireleaf hibiscus, whose petals could reduce inflammation; the moon-petal jasmine, a powerful antipyretic; the bitter root of the Serengeti grass, which had antimicrobial properties. I could hear him typing furiously, no doubt having one of his assistants cross-reference the names with the embassy's botanical inventory. A moment later, he came back on the line, amazed. "They're all here. How could you possibly know that?" "Because I pay attention to the world I live in, Edward, not just the one that's printed on official letterhead." I let the sting of the remark hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "But those are only the easy ones. There are others, things you won't find in any garden." A week after Dr. Hayes fell ill, the death toll inside the embassy had climbed to 7. The gleaming white clinic had become a place of dread. The healthy barricaded themselves in their apartments, communicating through notes slipped under doors. The compound, once bustling with life, was eerily silent, the quiet punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren from the dying city outside, or the racking cough of a neighbor through a thin wall. Edward's carefully constructed order had completely disintegrated. He was no longer a diplomat. He was a warden of a prison where the executioner was invisible. He finally made the call I had been expecting, the one his pride had fought against for so long. "I need you to come," he said, the words sounding foreign and brittle in his mouth. We need you here." There was no negotiation, no quid pro quo. It was a simple, desperate plea. Getting to the embassy was a risk. The streets of Ambalan were dangerous, not just because of the plague, but because of the chaos it had spawned. Law and order were distant memories, but I couldn't refuse. To do so would be to abandon the core principle I had built my life around: you help those who need it, even if one of them is your brother. "I'll be there by morning," I said. "Have your security meet me at the north gate. And Edward, find the largest, best ventilated room you have. A ballroom, a reception hall, something with high ceilings and windows that open. Our hospital needs to breathe." The journey across the city was surreal. I drove my old Land Rover through streets that were littered with debris and the ghosts of normal life. I saw things I would never forget. But my focus was absolute. In the passenger seat was a large sealed container filled with the most critical ingredients for the remedy: rare mosses, dried fungi, and powdered barks I had gathered from the deepest parts of the jungle over the years. My personal apothecary. When I arrived at the embassy's north gate, 2 grim-faced security guards were waiting. They wore full hazmat suits, their faces obscured by plastic visors. They looked at my simple linen clothes and my cloth mask with undisguised suspicion. They took my temperature, doused me and my supplies in a foul-smelling disinfectant, and led me through the manicured, eerily empty grounds. Edward met me at the entrance to the main chancery building. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His suit was rumpled, his hair was out of place, and his eyes were hollow with exhaustion and fear. He saw the crate I was carrying. "Is that it?" he asked. "The cure?" "It's the beginning of a chance," I corrected him. "Where's the room?" He led me to the grand ballroom, a magnificent space with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. It was where he had hosted the trade delegation reception just a few weeks earlier. Now it was going to be an infirmary. "This will do," I said, setting down my crate. "Now I need help. I need volunteers. People who are still healthy. I need them to strip this room of everything but the essentials. We need beds, or at least mattresses. We need clean water, and we need to start fires in the old fireplaces. We need to boil everything." My arrival was met with a mixture of hope and deep-seated skepticism. I was an outsider, a strange figure in dusty clothes, spouting instructions that sounded like ancient folklore. I saw the looks in their eyes. They saw a witch doctor, not a physician. Edward, to his credit, used what was left of his authority to support me. "Listen to him," he commanded the small group of staff he had gathered. "He is a doctor. He knows this disease. For now his word is law." The transformation of the ballroom began. We dragged in mattresses from the residential suites. The kitchen staff, under my direction, began the laborious process of brewing the base for the remedy, a dark, pungent tea made from the ingredients I'd brought and the plants gathered from the gardens. The air filled with the alien scents of boiling bark and steeping petals, overwhelming the familiar smell of floor polish and old paper. Our first patients were brought in from the clinic and from their self-imposed isolation. They were terrified. I moved among them, my voice calm and steady, explaining what I was doing, even as I worked. I had learned long ago that fear was a symptom you had to treat as aggressively as the fever itself. Edward watched me, his expression unreadable. He was a man adrift, stripped of his familiar tools of power. His memos and meetings were useless here. He tried to organize a duty roster, to create a spreadsheet tracking patient symptoms. It was his way of trying to impose order on the chaos. "Edward," I said to him, not unkindly, as he stood in the middle of the room with a clipboard, looking lost, "stop managing and start helping. Go get more blankets. And tell the guards at the gate to stop burning the dead. We need to bury them. Deep. Burning releases the spores." He flinched, shocked by the bluntness of it all, but he went and did as I asked. He was starting to understand. This wasn't a diplomatic crisis. It was a biological one. and in this new world his title meant nothing. My knowledge meant everything. The work was relentless. I barely slept, moving from patient to patient, administering the remedy, checking their breathing, changing the cool cloths on their heads. A few of the embassy staff, seeing the genuine care I was providing, began to trust me. A young communications officer named Sarah, whose husband was among the sick, became my most dedicated assistant. She learned to mix the remedies, her initial fear replaced by a fierce determination. We were a small, strange team, fighting a desperate battle in a palace ballroom. One evening, as I was crushing herbs with a mortar and pestle, Edward approached me. He was holding 2 cups of the bitter remedy tea. He handed one to me. "Isabella is coughing," he said, his voice a low whisper of dread. "I heard her just now." I looked at him, at the raw terror in his eyes. For the first time I didn't see the celebrated diplomat, the golden son who had overshadowed me my entire life. I saw a man, a husband, terrified of losing the person he loved most. "Bring her here," I said gently. "Bring her now, Edward. We'll fight for her, together." He nodded, his throat too tight for words, and turned to go to his wife. In that moment, the vast chasm that had separated us for decades began to feel, for the very first time, just a little bit smaller. The plague had taken everything from him, but it was also giving him something back, a chance to see his brother and the world for what they truly were. Isabella's arrival in the ballroom infirmary marked a new, more personal phase of the siege. She was weak, leaning heavily on Edward, her elegant composure shattered by the fever that was already beginning to take hold. Her presence sent a fresh wave of fear through the healthy residence. If the first secretary's wife wasn't safe, then no one was. For Edward, it was the ultimate failure. He had built a life on his ability to protect, to provide, to control his environment. Now, the one person he cherished most was at the mercy of the same invisible enemy that had breached his walls and made a mockery of his authority. He hovered over her bed, a helpless giant, trying to offer comfort with inadequate words. He smoothed her hair, adjusted her pillows. His hands, usually so steady when signing treaties, now trembling with fear. I watched him for a moment before stepping in. "Edward, she needs to rest. Your anxiety isn't helping her." "I'm not leaving her," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to be useful. I need more of the Serengeti grass root. It has to be washed and scraped. Sarah can show you what to do." My tone was firm, the tone of a doctor, not a younger brother. For the first time in our lives, our roles were reversed. I was the one with authority, and he was the one taking orders. He looked at me, a flicker of his old arrogance warring with his new desperation. Desperation won. He gave Isabella's hand one last squeeze and walked over to the preparation tables. The days bled into one another, a grueling cycle of brewing remedies, tending to the sick and managing the dwindling morale of the survivors. The ballroom was now filled with over 30 patients. The air was thick with the scent of herbs, sweat, and sickness. The crystal chandeliers were dark, coated in a film of soot from the fireplaces we kept burning day and night. The plague was a relentless tide. For every patient who showed a slight improvement, 2 more would be carried in. My initial remedies were helping. They were slowing the progression, reducing the severity of the fevers. But they weren't a cure. The death toll continued to rise, albeit more slowly. We were losing ground. Edward, surprisingly, adapted. After his initial clumsy attempts to manage the crisis, he seemed to accept his new role. He became a tireless worker. He hauled buckets of water, scraped roots until his hands were raw, and learned to clean and sterilize the equipment with meticulous care. He even learned to sit with the dying, offering a quiet presence when there was nothing else left to offer. I saw a side of him I never knew existed. The arrogance was stripped away, burned off by the fever of our shared crisis, and what was left was a man of surprising resilience and depth. He never complained, never pulled rank. He just worked. But the strain was showing on both of us. One night I found him slumped in a chair by one of the darkened windows, staring out at the dead city. He looked ancient. "I sent another report today," he said, his voice hollow. "Attached it to a weather balloon with a GPS tracker. It's a long shot, but it's all I can think of. I detailed our situation. I recommended you for a commendation. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. A bit late for that, I suppose. I sat down in the chair opposite him. My own body ached with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in my bones. It's not about commendations, Edward. I know, he said quietly. I think I'm just starting to understand what it is about. All my life I've been building things. Alliances, treaties, a career. All of it with words and paper. I thought it was real. I thought it was important. He gestured around the dimly lit ballroom at the rows of sick and dying people. This is real. Life and death. Everything else is just a game. We sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, not like the ones that had defined our relationship for so long. It was a shared, exhausted peace. "Do you remember," he said suddenly, his voice soft, "that summer when you were 10? You spent the entire vacation mapping the root system of the old oak tree in the back garden. You had charts, drawings, you were so meticulous." I was stunned that he remembered. "You told Father it was a waste of time, that I should be practicing my public speaking." He winced. The memory clearly painful. I did. I was an arrogant little prat. Father had decided I was the smart one, the successful one, and I believed him. "I thought your interests were quaint, unserious." He looked at me, his eyes full of a regret that seemed to have been fermenting for 30 years. "I was wrong, Elias, about everything. You weren't wasting your time, you were learning to see the world. I was just learning to talk about it." The confession, so simple and so profound, disarmed me completely. The anger and resentment I had carried for so long, a heavy cloak on my shoulders, suddenly felt a little lighter. It wasn't a solution, not an absolution, but it was a start. The very next day, our fragile progress was shattered. Isabella took a turn for the worse. Her breathing became shallow, her cough more violent. The rash, which had been faint on her skin, began to deepen, its crimson petals spreading across her chest. I examined her, my heart sinking. The remedies were holding the line for most, but for those with a weaker constitution, like Isabella, it wasn't enough. The fungus, or whatever it was winning. Edward was inconsolable. He stood by her bed, whispering her name, his face a mask of agony. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, watching the Diplomat's world crumble. I knew I was running out of time. My knowledge was deep, but it wasn't infinite. There had to be something I was missing, a piece of the puzzle I hadn't found. I retreated to a quiet corner with my old notebooks, the ones filled with my handwritten notes from years of conversations with the Casnian healers and elders. I scanned page after page of my spidery script, searching for a forgotten detail, a half-remembered story. And then I found it, a short entry, scribbled years ago, about a story an old woman had told me. She spoke of a plague-eater flower, a rare orchid that only bloomed in the high cliffs during the monsoon season. She said its properties were so potent, so dangerous, that it could either purge the deadliest sickness or kill a healthy man with a single touch. It had to be prepared in a precise way, its toxins neutralized by a specific moss that grew only beside it. She called it the sunstone orchid, for its brilliant golden color. My blood ran cold. The cliffs she had described were the ones that bordered the embassy's eastern wall, a sheer drop of hundreds of feet into the jungle below. It was a treacherous, unstable place, especially during the rains. It was a suicide mission. But as I looked over at Isabella and at the dozens of others fading in their beds, I knew it was our only hope. I found Edward and pulled him aside. I explained what I had found, my voice low and urgent. "It's our only shot, Edward. The orchid, if I can find it and prepare it correctly, could turn the tide." He looked from my face to the rain-lashed cliffs visible through the tall windows. He understood the danger immediately. "You can't go alone, it's too risky. The ground will be slick, unstable. I don't have a choice." "No," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of its old command. "You're too valuable. If something happens to you, we all die. I'll go." I stared at him. You wouldn't know what to look for. You don't know the terrain. Then you'll tell me. Draw me a picture. Describe it. I'm a quick study." The old arrogance was back, but this time it was in service of a desperate, selfless act. "You'll be killed, Edward." "Isabella is dying," he said, his voice breaking. If there is a 1 in a million chance to save her, I am taking it. I have spent my entire life in safe, comfortable rooms protected from any real danger. Maybe it's time I did something that actually mattered. We stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. He was determined to go, to finally do something tangible, to risk his own life for the wife he adored. But I knew he would fail. He didn't have the skills, the knowledge of the land. He would die on those cliffs, and our last hope would die with him. There was only one solution, as insane as it seemed. "We'll go together," I said, the words feeling heavy and fateful. "You have the strength, the strategic mind. I have the knowledge. It's the only way." He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time I saw not a rival, not a benchmark against which I was measured, but a brother. He nodded slowly. "Together." The plan was madness. We would use the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, when the rain was usually at its lightest. We'd rappel down the embassy wall from a service balcony, cross a narrow, overgrown ledge, and search the cliff face for an impossibly rare flower. We gathered our supplies, climbing ropes from the security locker, flashlights, a small medical kit, and a specially lined satchel to carry the orchid if we found it. As we prepared, Sarah watched us, her face pale with worry. "You can't both go," she pleaded. "If you don't come back." "You know the remedies, Sarah," I told her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You know how to keep everyone stable. Just hold the line until we get back." Edward wrote a letter, his handwriting tight and controlled, and left it on Isabel's bedside table. He gave her sleeping form one last look, his heart in his eyes, and then turned to me. "Let's go." The descent down the slick, moss-covered wall was terrifying. The wind whipped around us, trying to tear us from our precarious handholds. Edward, to my surprise, was a natural. His years of squash and fencing had given him a wiry strength and a cool head. He moved with a precision and economy of motion that I, a man more used to walking jungle paths, lacked. He guided our descent, calling out warnings, testing the ropes, his mind working with a strategic clarity that I had to admire. We finally reached the ledge, a treacherous ribbon of mud and rock, no wider than a footpath. Below us, the jungle canopy was a dark, churning sea. The rain started again, a cold, driving downpour that soaked us to the bone in seconds. "We need to be methodical," Edward shouted over the roar of the wind. "We'll work in a grid pattern. You scan for the flower, I'll watch our footing." For hours we moved along the cliff face, our flashlights cutting feeble beams through the gray murk. The mud was like grease, constantly trying to pull our feet out from under us. Twice Edward grabbed my arm, pulling me back from the edge as the ground crumbled away. We were a team, a single unit, our movements synchronized by a shared purpose and a shared danger. The resentment that had been the bedrock of our relationship was gone, scoured away by the wind and the rain. There was no time for it, no space for it on this narrow ledge between life and death. Here we were not the diplomat and the doctor. We were just two brothers fighting for survival. "Why did you stay, Elias?" Edward yelled, his voice strained as he braced himself against a rock face. "All these years, you could have had a prestigious practice anywhere in the world. Why here?" The question was so direct, so honest, that it cut through my defenses. "Because here, what I do matters in a way I can see and feel," I shouted back. "I'm not just a name on a chart. I'm Elias. I helped deliver their children. I sat with their dying elders. They taught me things our father's money could never buy. I found a family here, Edward, a real one." He was silent for a moment, the wind howling around us. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "He was proud of you, you know, in his own way. He didn't know how to show it. Your world was so foreign to him. He didn't have the words for it." The words hit me harder than the rain. I had spent my entire adult life believing my father saw me as nothing but a disappointment. To hear otherwise here, on the edge of the world, was a revelation that shook me to my core. "He never said anything to me." "That was his failing, Elias. Not yours," Edward said, his voice raw. "And it was my failing, too. I was so busy trying to win a game he invented that I never stopped to see that you were playing a different one, a better one. I'm sorry. For all of it. For not seeing you." The apology, offered without caveat or expectation, was the thing I never knew I needed to hear. A lifetime of hurt, of feeling invisible next to his blinding success, began to wash away in the monsoon rain. It was then that I saw it, a flash of impossible, brilliant gold, nestled in a small crevice about 20 feet above us. There, I breathed, pointing with a trembling hand. The sunstone orchid. It was in an almost unreachable spot. The rock face around it was sheer and slick with algae. There was no direct way up. "I can't make that climb," I said, my heart sinking. "I don't have the skill." "But I do," Edward said, his eyes fixed on the flower. He was already checking his rope, his mind calculating angles and handholds. "I'll anchor myself here. You talk me through it. Be my eyes, Elias." He began to climb, his powerful frame moving with a terrifying grace against the wet rock. He was all focus and determination, every muscle strained. I stood below, my heart pounding in my chest, guiding him, pointing out the almost invisible cracks in the rock he could use. He was 10 feet up when his foot slipped. He slammed against the cliff face, the air driven from his lungs with a grunt of pain. He dangled there for a moment, his life hanging by the rope and the strength in his arms. "Edward," I screamed. He didn't answer. He just hung there, his head down. Then slowly, painstakingly, he began to move again. He pulled himself up, inch by agonizing inch, his knuckles white, his face a mask of pure grit. He reached the crevice, his breath coming in ragged gasps. With an almost reverent gentleness, he plucked the single perfect orchid and the moss growing beside it, placing them carefully into the satchel. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. We made it to the wall just as the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. We practically fell back onto the balcony, collapsing into a heap of mud, rope, and relief. We had done it. We had the orchid. As we lay there gasping for breath, Edward looked at me, a real genuine smile spreading across his bruised and battered face. "See," he managed to say, "a diplomat and a witch doctor, not such a bad team." In the ballroom, the atmosphere was grim. Our return was met with exhausted, hopeful stares. Sarah rushed to us, her eyes wide with questions. I didn't waste a moment. I took the satchel to the preparation table, my hands moving with a surgeon's precision. The process was delicate. I had to crush the moss into a paste and use it to coat the orchid's stem, neutralizing its toxin before steeping it in the hot remedy base. The entire room was silent, watching me, their collective hope resting on my tired shoulders. Edward, despite his own exhaustion and the deep bruises covering his body, stood guard, keeping everyone back, giving me the space I needed. I administered the first dose of the enhanced remedy to Isabella. Her breathing was dangerously shallow. I wasn't sure if we had been in time. Edward sat by her side, holding her hand, speaking to her in a low, gentle voice, telling her about the sunrise he had seen from the cliff face. For the next few hours, all we could do was wait. I moved through the infirmary, giving the new remedy to the most critical patients, a small measure of the precious liquid for each. The change, when it came, was subtle at first. Around noon, I noticed the rhythm of Isabel's breathing was evening out. It was still labored, but the desperate, shallow gasps were gone. A few hours later, the angry crimson of the rash on her chest began to fade, receding like a tide. By evening, her fever broke. She opened her eyes, blinking in the dim light of the ballroom, and her gaze found Edward. "You look terrible," she whispered, a faint smile on her lips. Edward let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with a relief so profound it was painful to watch. A quiet, hopeful murmur went through the room. One by one, the other critical patients began to stabilize. The sunstone orchid wasn't a miracle, but it was a powerful enough weapon to give the body the edge it needed to win. The tide had turned. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of recovery. There were no more deaths. The sick slowly began to regain their strength. The ballroom, once a place of despair, transformed into a convalescent ward. People started to smile again. The sound of quiet conversation replaced the constant coughing. Edward's transformation was the most profound. The crisis had broken him, but it had reforged him into someone new. The arrogant first secretary was gone. In his place was a man who was quiet, humble, and profoundly grateful. He never left Isabella's side, but he also continued to work, doing the most menial tasks without a word of complaint. He would bring me food, insist I get a few hours of sleep, and would stand watch over the patients while I rested. He started talking to the Kasnian staff, not as their superior, but as their equal. He asked them about their families, about their homes in the city. He listened, truly listened, for the first time. One afternoon, as we were sitting by a window watching a group of children who were finally well enough to play in the gardens again, he turned to me. "When this is over," he said, "I'm going to make sure the world knows what you did here, what the local healers did. This knowledge, it can't be allowed to be dismissed as folklore anymore. It saved us. It's not my knowledge to give, Edward. It belongs to the people of this country. Then I'll help you build the finest medical research center this country has ever seen," he said with a flash of his old energy. "A place where your knowledge and their tradition can meet modern science on equal terms. We'll get the funding. I'll make it my personal mission." I looked at him, and I knew he meant it. He wasn't trying to take over or control my world. He was trying to build a bridge to it. The quarantine lasted for another 2 months. The world outside slowly got a handle on the crimson bloom, developing a vaccine based on samples that had been smuggled out of the country early on. But for the 200 souls trapped inside the embassy, their survival was owed to ancient wisdom and 2 brothers who had found their way back to each other on the edge of a cliff. When the gates finally opened, the world that greeted us was changed. The embassy was no longer an island of power, but a place of quiet reverence. The survivors emerged, blinking in the bright sunlight, with a shared experience that had bonded them forever. Edward kept his word. His official report was a stunning document. It bypassed diplomatic platitudes and told the raw, unvarnished truth of what had happened. He gave me and the Kasnian healers full credit for our survival, calling our work the highest form of diplomacy, the negotiation between science and tradition, between despair and hope. He was lauded for his honesty and his leadership in some circles, and criticized for his unorthodoxy in others. He didn't care. He had learned to measure his success by a different metric. His marriage to Isabella was stronger than ever. They had faced death together and come out the other side with a deeper appreciation for the fragile gift of life. And my relationship with Edward, it was new. It was quiet, and it was real. We didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore. We had a shared language now, forged in fear and respect. I didn't accept his offer to run a big research center. That was his world, the world of buildings and budgets. My place was here, in my small clinic, with the people who had trusted me when I had nothing. But with a sizable anonymous donation that I knew came from him, I was able to expand my clinic, to bring in more supplies, to train local nurses, to create a place that was a true bridge between 2 worlds. A place where a child's fever could be treated with both an antibiotic and a cooling cloth infused with moon-petal jasmine. A few years later, Edward, Isabella, and their young daughter came to visit. Not on a diplomatic mission, but for a simple holiday. I took them not on a tour of the rebuilt capital, but deep into the jungle, showing my niece the plants and insects that had fascinated me as a boy. Edward watched us, a contented smile on his face. That evening, we sat on the porch of my small house, sharing a simple meal of rice and grilled fish, watching the fireflies begin to glow in the twilight. There was no talk of politics, no mention of family portraits or proper suits. We were just 2 brothers, sharing a peaceful silence, finally at home in the same world. My life was no longer a disappointment, and his was no longer a performance. We had found our own kind of truth, not in the bright glare of public success, but in the quiet, shared darkness of a ballroom, where all that mattered was the steady sound of a loved one's breathing. The world may remember Edward Thorne as the celebrated diplomat, but to me he will always be the man who climbed a cliff in the pouring rain for a single golden flower. And I, the doctor who was scorned for wasting his life, learned that a life isn't wasted if it teaches you what is truly worth saving. Thank you for listening to my story. It's a reminder that sometimes the people who underestimate us the most are the ones who end up needing us the most. Your true value isn't determined by the opinions of others, but by the strength and knowledge you cultivate in your own heart. I'd love to read your own stories in the comments below, Have you ever had a moment where a skill others dismissed turned out to be incredibly important? Share it with our community. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you for being here with me. Remember to be kind to each other and to value the quiet wisdom that often goes unseen.